you have chicken and milk together?
Why can't we have chicken and milk together? Okay, let me ask you a question. Are birds meat?
Yes.
Yes, they are. Yes, birds are meat. How do you know?
They bleed.
Ha! You just guessed because of my tone of voice.
Because they bleed.
He knows me too well. No. Is there proof from the Torah that birds are meat?
No, it says that some of them are forbidden. That 27 are forbidden.
So are crickets forbidden? Doesn't make them meat. What's the proof that birds are meat? Because when the people ask for meat, and Moses says, I'm going to give you meat, they end up eating slav, quail. So birds are meat. I didn't come to this until recently. After all the years of studying it and thinking about it and everything else, it suddenly hit me when I read that verse, that birds are meat. So, now, the Torah says, don't cook a young animal in its mother's milk. But bird mothers don't have milk. Bird mothers lay eggs. They don't have any milk. So the kind of meat that's forbidden with milk is the meat of an animal whose mother gives milk. So birds are meat that's not forbidden with milk. But they're meat. And for a person to be told this kind of meat yes and that kind of meat no, you're going to end up with people finding it difficult to make the distinction. I used to say, because people will confuse turkey meat with veal, and try to make a case for that. But it occurred to me, the Torah calls birds meat. They are meat. It's just the kind of meat so the Rabbanan often round off the corners so as to make sure that honest, well-meaning people who are subject to mistakes and ignorance won't make mistakes. Yeah, fire away.
What about medicine and the lack of grinding? They prohibit medicine to this, but it was kind of like, why do we not, if the decree doesn't apply to nowadays?
Okay, this is a very, very important question, a very fundamental question, and I will answer at some length because it's very important. You have a rabbinic decree, rabbinic rule that's designed to do something. In particular, let's take a rabbinic rule that's designed to protect against a possible biblical violation. There was a time when doing what the rabbis prohibited could in fact lead you to a biblical violation. That could happen. Today, because circumstances have changed, it would not lead you to a biblical violation. So why is that rule still binding? And the example you're asking about is medicine. The reason why medicines for non-dangerous conditions on Shabbos, medicines are forbidden is because in those days, medicines were stored as solids and you took them as powders, which meant that when you wanted to take the medicine, you had to grind it into a powder. Grinding is a biblical prohibition on Shabbos. So to keep people from mistakenly grinding on Shabbos, they say don't take medicines when there's no danger, just for comfort's sake or for symptomatic relief. Now, today, no one stores medicines as blocks of solid, which have to be ground into powder in order to be used. So the question is, why does the law still apply if its purpose no longer applies? I must tell you, I have very little sympathy for this question. In a totally secular context, based on pragmatics, no one would ask such a question. No one would ask such a question. Everyone would understand automatically himself why it doesn't apply. I'll give you an example. 1973, there was an Arab-Israeli war. And one of the results of it was the Arab countries imposed an oil embargo on the United States. I don't know how many months it was, a year, when there was no oil and gas was in very short supply and there was gas rationing. Imagine the following scenario. In May, the Arabs call off and one of the rules that the government enacted was a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit and the national speed limit, because engines run quite efficiently 55 miles an hour. As you go faster, they run much less efficiently. They burn up more gas per mile, so they made a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. Okay, now imagine that in May, the Arabs cancel the oil boycott. By the end of June, crude oil is reaching the United States shores. By July, the gas hits the pumps. By August, the price is down. There's plentiful gas. And here's George racing down the highway at 75 miles an hour. So the state trooper pulls him over and says, George, the speed limit is 55 miles an hour. It's a national law. What are you doing? And George says to the state trooper, don't you understand? The reason they made the 55 mile an hour speed limit is to save gas. That's because there was an Arab oil embargo. But now the embargo's over, and there's lots of gas, and it went down to the normal price. There's no more rationing. So why shouldn't I go 75 miles an hour? What will the state trooper tell him? George, it's a law. It's a law. It's a law that was passed by Congress. And the law is enforced until Congress changes it. Purpose schmurpose. I'm not interested in what the purpose was, or whether it was an embargo, it wasn't an embargo, blah, 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 gas prices were high or low. As long as the law is a law, you have to follow it, and you're going to pay. Everybody understands that. Nobody thinks that when a law stops serving its purpose, it suddenly becomes inapplicable, invalid, void, and you can do as you please. Nobody thinks that. Whatever body passed the law has to make up its mind to change the law. And by the way, the law wasn't changed for 20 years because in the interim, they discovered that 55 mile an hour speed limit had other benefits for people. But leave that aside. As long as the body in charge hasn't changed its mind, the law is in force. The fact that it doesn't serve its original purpose anymore, doesn't play any role in the reasoning whatsoever. No one would raise that question about American law. So why should they raise it about Jewish law? 1 second. But then the person will say, all right, I understand. But look, you're talking about August. Now it's true, Congress doesn't get back into session until October, because in August they're climbing the China Wall, and they're scuba diving in Eilat, and so on and so on, our legislators. So you wait 4 months. But in 4 months, the legislature will get together and will reconsider the issue. They'll either change the law or they won't. But there's a process by which it can be reconsidered and reevaluated. Here, you're talking about laws of the Sanhedrin. We have been without a Sanhedrin for 1,600 years. Isn't that a long time to wait? After a while, shouldn't we take things into our own hands or use some other strategy for dealing with the fact that the circumstances have changed? Well, that depends upon how you understand history, the loss of the Sanhedrin, Jewish law, divine providence. It depends upon the framework you're operating in. If you think history is accidental, if you think it's not under control, if you think we lost the Sanhedrin because of the Roman persecutions, the Romans stopped the line of ordination, of smicha, and you have to have smicha to be a candidate for the Sanhedrin. We don't have smicha anymore, no Sanhedrin. If you think it's just a matter of happenstance, and you think that Jewish law itself is only a human cultural product, I agree with you 100%. There's no reason to wait 1,600 years. There's no reason to wait 20 years. Form a new institution, create a new authority, and rewrite your laws as you please. But of course, that's not our view. Our view is that there's a creator of the universe who's running the world, who revealed his will at Sinai. And among the things he revealed to us is that a law passed by the Sanhedrin can be reversed only by a later Sanhedrin. Furthermore, history is not happenstance, accidental, random, accidental, but God is organizing history also, so that if we lost the Sanhedrin, it's because divine providence was behind the losing the Sanhedrin, and now all you are asked to do is to put 2 and 2 together and get 4. The first 2 is, God said, a law of the Sanhedrin has to be removed by another Sanhedrin. The second 2 is, God took away the Sanhedrin. 4 is, then God doesn't want us to change that law. If that's not obvious, I'll say it again. God took away the Sanhedrin, and God made a rule that says only Sanhedrin laws can be changed only by a Sanhedrin, from which it follows that God doesn't want us to change those laws. So from the point of view of our system, again, there's no question here. There's no question. Now, having said all of that, the surprise is that there are some exceptions. There are some exceptions where, when conditions change, now watch how I switch my vocabulary. When conditions change, practice changes. Why would that be? Now that I've explained to you why it should never change, why would that be? I'll explain a little bit, and then I'll give you an example. I say practice changes. The law never changes, but practice might change. What you do might change. Here's an example. The Talmud says, certain liquids, like water, if you leave them uncovered and unattended, you can't drink them. They become forbidden to drink. You look in the Shulchan Aruch, it rules that in our times you can drink them. The practice has changed. How could that be? Especially if the Talmud is the last authority in Jewish law. Beyond that, you can't change any of the laws. You can't revise them. How could it be? The Talmud says don't drink them. And Shulchan Aruch says you can drink them. Because, I'm quoting a Stipler going now, because in this case, the law is not don't drink uncovered, unattended liquids. That's not the law. The law is don't take risks with your health. Don't take risks with your health. That's the law. That law is just as enforced today as it was in Talmudic times. It has not changed one iota. But what was dangerous in Talmudic times isn't dangerous anymore. The reason the liquids were dangerous in Talmudic times is because snakes and scorpions were common in their habitations. And if you left the water uncovered and unattended, a snake or a scorpion might come to drink and leave behind traces of poison, and it could be dangerous. The author of the Shulchan Aruch says in our habitations, we don't have snakes and scorpions anymore, so it's not dangerous anymore. So the law is still in force. It doesn't change a bit. Make sure you don't take chances with your health. But this isn't a chance with your health anymore. So the practice of forbidding those liquids is no longer applicable, according to the author of the Shulchan Aruch. Others disagree, but that's his position. But the law never changes. So that's the bottom line. The law never changes unless the apparatus for changing it is available. To law the Sanhedrin, you need another Sanhedrin. Somebody asks, but we're waiting a long time. Obviously, God wants us to wait a long time. Since he's running history, and he told us that only the Sanhedrin can revoke a law by the Sanhedrin, and he's telling us, I don't want you to tamper with these laws. And that's why, even though the law doesn't serve its function, we're still bound by it.
But how is that different with medicine? The law is you can't grind.
No, the law there is, don't do anything that could lead you. No, I'm sorry. The law there, I'm sorry, I didn't finish the example. Thank you. The law there is, don't take medicine. I have to say this in a little more detail. Okay. I'll say it in a little more detail. Consider the following type of statement. A, because B. A, because B. That might work out in two different ways. One way is this. I have a law A. Do A. That's what it says on page 66 of the law book. There's a footnote to page 1942 in the footnotes. It says, you know why they passed law A? Because they were trying to accomplish B. But the law is A. The law is don't take medicines when you're not in danger on Shabbos. Reason because of grinding. But the law is don't take medicines. Laws never change. 1 second. The law never changes. In the second case, the law in the law book on page 66 is don't take unnecessary chances with your health. The footnote on page 1492 says, in our times, since uncovered and unattended liquids can be dangerous, we are telling you an application of that law is not to drink those liquids. But that's the footnote. Drinking the liquids is the footnote. So the law is don't take unnecessary chances with your health, and we're abiding by that law 100% without changing it. In the case of medicine, the law was don't take medicines. Had the law, and by the way, there's a difference of opinion about this. You can't tell what the real formulation of the law is by reading the Talmud with your handy dictionary at hand, the way certain critics do. The only way you can understand what the real formulation of the law is to look especially into the Rishonim, into the medieval commentators, and read them with careful attention. Some do say that the basic law was don't take chances with grinding, and therefore they are much more lenient about taking medicines on Shabbos because of that. But if you think that the original law was don't take medicines, then you can't budge, even though the original reason for the law doesn't apply anymore. That's the bottom line, yeah.
Because nowadays we poskin that if you're allowed to take a premeditatory, like if you feel a headache coming up, but you don't actually have a headache, you're allowed to take the medicine.
It depends. It depends on what kind of headache. I mean, I've said many times, I'm not an expert in halacha, but as far as I know, you have to be something that's called chola kol gufo, not for the mishkav or chola kol gufo. Either you can't stand up, you're fell into bed, or your whole body is affected, you're dizzy, you can't concentrate. You get to that point, then you're allowed to take medicine. But okay, that's a matter of the details, not the question. You asked a philosophical question, and that's where I'm trained. I'm trained in philosophy, not in practical law. Okay, next. Yeah.
Two-part question.
Sorry, he had his hand up.
Regarding if you're a Baal Shuva and your parents are completely like off the derech, how do you decide which minhagim to take upon yourself, and to what extent is that your individual decision, like whether or not, like for example, between meat and milk, how long to wait?
Yeah. Okay, from the words in your question, I'm going to give you an answer which may be a little bit surprising to you. Even if your parents are fully religious and represent a fully functioning tradition, you're not bound by it. A child is not bound by the tradition of his parents. An Ashkenazi can become a Sephardi can become an Ashkenazi, Lithuanian yeshiva bacher can become a Chassid. I wouldn't say the other way because it's prejudicial, but okay. It does happen from time to time. Right? There's nothing binding you to the customs of your family. It's your own individual decision with which group you want to identify. Now, however, again, based on the way you asked your question, it's not a question of picking and choosing one by one. Although I'm not aware of a strict legal prohibition against doing that, it's colossally dumb. I know because I did it for 10 years until I figured out that it was dumb. And the reason it's dumb is because the particular legal decisions and particular customs you go by are supposed to form an organic whole. They're supposed to reinforce one another. They're supposed to form a coherent picture. The likelihood of someone who's coming in from the outside on the basis of his own sensitivity and genius, forming a vast array of legal positions and customs that is an organized, integrated picture is zero. So the best you can do is choose one of the forms that have been created over time by great spiritual geniuses, attach yourself to such a form and follow it in all of its details. Nothing binds you one way or the other. Nothing binds you one way or the other, even if you came from a religious family. Yeah.
Just on that, doesn't tradition sometimes decide specific legal questions?
Yes, that's right. Although it's a tricky point. For example, a tradition can decide what item you use to fulfill a mitzvah. I learned this from Rabbi Meiselman. The Yemenites have a tradition that a certain fruit is an esrog, but it's gigantic, it's like this big. Right? And he said other communities that don't have that tradition can't use it. The tradition, in this case the minhag, the custom, determines how to fulfill the law. That can be such cases as well. Anyway, but that's a fine point. Yeah, what's that?
Two-part question. If someone tells you that they're doing a lot of good deeds towards, let's say, their fellow man would be the normal case, and they're not religious, so they're not too bad off. So what would be the best way to respond to that? And secondly, let's say someone says he's in, for example, medical school, and if he comes to study in yeshiva, so he's going to have to push off his helping other people through medicine. So therefore, he doesn't want to sacrifice it.
A person who's doing. Let me answer the question this way. You hear a lot of people say, "Well, he keeps Shabbos and he keeps kosher and he gets only the finest meat and he waits 72 minutes after Shabbos, but he cheats at business." He's a bum. He's not really religious. That's just a facade. He doesn't treat people right. He cheats people. Then he's a bum. Treats people nicely, gives charity, supports people, visits the people in the old age homes, and so on, but cheats on Shabbos. Well, listen, treats people nicely. That's really what counts, and so forth and so on. That's just completely out of it's off the page. It's completely off the page. There is a creator. We are monotheists. There's only one creator. He gave a set of laws. Some of them govern how we interact with other people, and some of them govern how we interact with him. They're all divine laws. A person who cheats on Shabbos is no more or less religious, no more or less competent religious than a person who cheats at business. God said not to cheat at business, and God said to keep Shabbos. Both of them are violating God's will. There's no reason to prefer one over the other. There's nothing in the Torah that prefers one over the other. The penalties for each type go from the top to the bottom levels of the penalties. It's 10 pronouncements have both kinds. Parshas Kedoshim, where it says you should be holy, has them interspersed with one another. There's absolutely no reason to give preference to the laws between man and man over the laws between man and God. They all come from one God. They're all binding. And a person who cheats on either side is just cheating. So I would say to this person, you're a nice guy, lovely. You probably get along nicely with other people, and you feel good about yourself. You're missing out on the most important reality in the world, and that is that there's a creator. You're missing out on that reality. You're not relating to that reality, and you're not fulfilling all of the divine laws that govern how you should live with God. First of all. Second of all, a slightly more subtle point: to fulfill a commandment, you have to be aware that there's a commander, and you have to intend that what you do should fulfill his commandment. If you don't have that awareness and you don't have that intention, you have not fulfilled the commandment. So maybe you give charity and pursue justice. That doesn't get you any credit in God's eyes at all, because you haven't fulfilled any commandments. Let's make it concrete. Under certain conditions, with certain definitions, you're supposed to give 10% of your income to charity. Suppose a person gives 10% of his income to charity this year as an atheist, and suddenly discovers God. Discovers that God's running the world, and the Torah says he has to give 10%. He's got to give another 10%, because the first 10% wasn't a mitzvah. A mitzvah requires intention to fulfill the will of the commander. One nice source of this is the Ramban's commentary in the book of Job, in the end of the introduction. So that's number one. Now, the person says, I don't want to put off helping other people by going to yeshiva. Our point of view is the amount of good you can do for other people is a matter of divine providence, as is everything else. So, if you fulfill God's will by going to yeshiva, number one, when you're studying Torah, you're doing good for other people. If I have to explain that, I will. And number two, if you're doing God's will by going to yeshiva, you can't do better than doing God's will. You're not going to outsmart God. You're not smart. You're not more powerful than God. You're not going to run a corner on God and run on God. If he told you to go to yeshiva, and you're calculating, I go to medical school, that I have to more years as a doctor, and those more years as a doctor will do more good for the world, it can't be right. Because the creator of the world, who's running history, told you, this is what I want you to do. By doing his will, you're not going to end up doing less good. So you'll do better, or you'll be attracted to a certain specialty which will become very important later, or whatever. You're not going to lose out in what you can do for the world by doing God's will. By definition, that's a non-starter. Yeah.
I had a couple of questions that I've written down over the week. One is, there's a famous phrase in Chazal. It says, "Ma kol ma she'atalmid katan shol es Rabbi." It was told over to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, right? And what capacity does that mean? I mean, like was that handed over to Moshe Rabbeinu? I mean, any child asks what could be interpreted as a stupid question, that was also told to Moshe Rabbeinu. What is it There is discussion of this, and I have not gone through all the sources on it, but the source that I know, like the Maharal and others, that I understand, none of this means that. By the way, I think it's a student will ask his teacher. I don't think it's a child will ask. I think a student will tell me Yishal's Rabbo, if I remember correctly. But it's Talmud Katan.
The Talmud Katan doesn't mean a 6-year-old. Right. It means one of the lower of the students. He could be 27 years old, but he's not the brightest of them, and so forth and so on. So what he was given is general principles. It also says anything that someone's going to invent later, any idea is going to invent later, anything that's going to be discovered anew, he was given all the principles from which these things can be derived. Statements in language, when they're looked at by different people from different points of view and different ages and different capacities, will be understood in different ways. A person who's really subtle and has comprehensive understanding will understand himself. Well, I can understand how a person could misread it this way. I just saw an essay. I mean, after all these years, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. It's based on the following mistake. Nobody came to the party. Well, did he have a good time? What do you mean? Nobody came. How old was nobody? The one who came to the party. You said nobody came to the party. So I'm asking you, did he have a good time? You know, how old was he? How was he dressed? Because nobody is the subject of the sentence. You confuse it with John came to the party. John came to the party. He could ask all those questions. Nobody's not the same name as somebody who came to the party. But I've seen intelligent people mix this up. God created the world out of nothing. Well, what was the nothing out of which he created it? That's just as bad. But I saw a whole article written in a respectable publication. What was the nothing out of which he created it? Now, you can avoid it in both cases. If you speak carefully, the way logicians are trained to speak. If you say, it is not the case that anybody came to the party, then you can't ask any questions. It is not the case that God created the world from something, then you can't ask any questions. But the word nothing in, or nobody in, it doubles as a noun, and it makes it sound like he's talking about something. There's something that's called nothing. And then you have a whole mysticism. How could a something be a nothing? Well, it's a kind of nothing something. And, Judaism is beyond your understanding, and so on and so on. It's just a mistake of language. But I can understand how people make that mistake. I taught logic, and my students made that mistake regularly. So I understand how that mistake can be made. So if I'm teaching, and I know that these are the formulations, and I know my students and other capacities, I can say, there'll be a student who'll say this, there'll be a student who'll misunderstand it that way, they'll definitely ask this question. I can predict that because I know what I'm saying and I know the capacities of the people who are going to be dealing with it. That's not a question of receiving a divine record of the entire future history of the world. That's not what's meant. And the same is true with new ideas that can be derived. If you understand the principles and you understand logic, and you understand how new ideas can be derived from these principles. All of that is because Moses was given all the principles that are appropriate and all the logic that's appropriate to be applied to the Torah to derive new ideas.
When going into a curative environment, how do you decide how much you are able to compromise your own values in order to influence others?
Okay. You've been here for a while, so you know me by now. It's in my bones. I have to take the words apart and make sure the words are being used correctly, and then maybe I'll get to the substance of the question. You are asking, when I go into a curative environment, how much do I have to sacrifice my own values for the sake of the curative project? Why isn't the curative project your own value? Why isn't it your value? When you make a choice of preferences or priorities between two demands, and you decide that this was more important than the other, why are you sacrificing your values? I'll give you a similar thing. I heard a story of a fellow. His son got up to go to yeshiva every morning, left the house at 6 o'clock. This fellow got up at 5:45. When his son left the yeshiva, he was sitting there learning Torah. When his son walked out of the house, he went back to bed. Now, I heard people tell me, so he's a hypocrite. He's just pretending. No, he's expressing his love for his son, which is genuine. His love for his son is genuine. Would he get up if his son weren't leaving at 6? No, he would not. That doesn't mean getting up when his son is leaving is hypocritical. It means, if it were a question of my own sleep, I would not make the effort to get up. It's because I love my son and I want my son to leave the house with a positive image. That's also genuine. Here, if you have, let's say, a commitment to learning, and now you go into a curative setting, and you can't fulfill that commitment to learning, you have to make a principled decision. Is the activity of kiruv more important than that commitment to learning? If it is, then it's your value to do the kiruv, and it's your decision, together with your Rabbi, with your advisors, of course, that this is more important. Then you're not sacrificing your values. You're fulfilling your values. Now, in detail, this is a very, very complex decision to make. In particular, you have to look at all these decisions on two levels, two dimensions. One is, there are things I'm supposed to be doing, and there's a program that I have, and accomplishments that I have. And the other is the internal effect. How will you look at yourself? How will you feel about yourself? If you're going to feel that you're going down the drain, you're going to feel that you're losing out, even if the feeling is irrational, you have to take the feeling into account. You can't ignore the feeling. It can rob you of your motivation. It can rob you of your self-esteem. That can have terrible effects on you. So you have to be very realistic about your psychology and make a decision that takes your psychology into account. And that's something which you can only do together with someone who can advise you. And like everything else in life, you make the decision, you try it out. It may not be perfectly appropriate, then you may have to revise it. You have to keep an open mind and keep reevaluating. And this happens to everybody. My Rebbe Zatzal told me many, many years ago, and it was devastating when he told me, when one of the first things that happens when you go into Kiruv is that you lose your ability to daven. So, what? And he doesn't have an ability to daven? But there's a certain focus. And if you're worried about somebody, you're concerned about somebody, you feel that there's something else you have to do, you don't know what to do, and that's on your mind, and it's pressing on your mind, then that focus, which is ideal for tefillah, you're not going to have. And he was, of course, right, like everything's right about everything else. But the sources indicate that saving somebody else's spiritual life is more important than having that focus. So I'm not sacrificing my value. I'm expressing one of my values over another one in a resolution of conflict that is appropriate. Yeah.
It says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu looked into the Torah to create the world, right? So I was wondering if you could kind of like shed some light on exactly what that means. I mean, and just to put more in perspective where I'm coming from when I ask that question, it's like whenever you say Torah or think about Torah, I think about it as a physical thing in a big way. There's a Torah that we read this morning on Shabbos. You read the Parsha. It's like you have Sfarim, like Gemara, like fine. And you acquire that Torah, that knowledge that comes from there. But I mean, when you say that it's something that Hashem was looked into to create the world, I mean, that's something beyond.
Okay. Okay, this is a good question. It has a lot of ramifications. I'll just try to put a few on the table. It says God looked into the Torah and created the world. And the word that's used in the Midrash is blueprint. The Torah is like a blueprint for the creating of the world. Now, as you're speaking about it, Torah does not mean a piece of parchment. It does not mean a piece of parchment. And it is not limited to what we call the written Torah. Indeed, originally, Chazal say that there would have been, without the sin of the golden calf, there would have been 6 books, interestingly, 5 books of Moses and 1 of Joshua, and everything else would have come out of that. Everything else would have been how we understand that basic 6 books. By Torah there, I think it means the sum total. It means the text plus the way you understand the text. Text is not just shapes of ink on parchment. The text has a certain understanding, a certain content. And what it means is that God created the text, not parchment with shapes of ink, like when you memorize a poem. Right? You have the poem in your head, as we say. You don't have paper in your head. The poem is the words. They can be rendered on a piece of paper, but that's not the poem. The poem is something that's abstract. Now, what it means is that the Torah is the crystallization of God's will with which He created the world. He first formulated a model, and then He used the world to fulfill that model. Now, of course, this is dreadfully anthropomorphic, and it's meant to convey certain messages. One message that it conveys, I want to tell you now, is something that which is really, in intellectual terms, revolutionary. Suppose someone asks, there are 2 people in the world to whom I have a very special relationship, unlike my relationship to anybody else. They are my parents. They gave birth to me. I'm here in the world because of them. Does that register anywhere in the Torah? Does the Torah take care of that? Does the Torah address that biological fact anywhere? Answer is, of course. 2 of the 613 commandments: honor your parents, revere your parents, all sorts of applications and instructions. Sure, the Torah takes account of that. Sure, the Torah codifies that. What I just told you is exactly wrong. It's exactly wrong. It's upside down. The question is not, given the biological fact, what does the Torah say about it? The question is the opposite. The question we ought to ask is, why do we have parents? Don't take the biology for granted and look for an explanation. Question the biology. Why don't we reproduce like amoebae or grow like plants? Why do we have bisexual sexual reproduction that produces us? Answer, because there's a commandment of honoring your parents. That's why there's biological sexual reproduction. It's the Torah that explains the biology, not the biology that explains the Torah. That's one of the things that follows from this picture. God looked into the Torah and created the world. So the question is on the world. Why is the world the way it is? Answer, because the Torah requires it to be that way, because the Torah has certain principles that have to be embodied. Rabbi Yisvei, Zichrono Livracha, this was 1981, I think. I heard him say, why does the human being have the longest maturation period of any animal? In absolute terms and relative terms, it takes longer for a human newborn to become independent than any other species. By far. Why is that? Now understand, he's asking, why is the biology the way it is? And don't tell me that we are neotenous apes and it takes us longer because our brains are more plastic and so on and so on. That's just more physical stuff. The question is, why is the whole physical setup that way? You know what his answer was? Because God has laws for all of mankind, not just Jews, and he revealed them at one time, and they have to be communicated generation after generation. And that requires that the child grow up in a context in which the parents have enormous authority, and they've earned that authority by being almost perfectly right about everything. Teach the child his numbers and his colors and his shapes and his directions, how to tie a bow and so forth and so on, and they're right all the time. And while they're right all the time, they can pass down to him the tradition of how God wants him to live. So the question mark goes on the physical facts, and the explanation is in terms of what the Torah wants. That's one of the things you learn from, he looked into the Torah and created the world. The Torah is the model, and the world is built to fill that model. It teaches the right order of explanation. Now, usually connected to this question that you're dealing with is the following idea. Well, doesn't that make certain things inevitable? Let's see. Did Adam and Chava really have free will to eat from the tree of knowledge or not eat from the tree of knowledge? But it's written in the book of Genesis that they ate from the tree of knowledge and got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So if it's written there and the world's created to match the Torah, how is it possible that they should have free will and have not eaten from the tree of knowledge? That's a good question. That's a good question. Well-defined, precise contradiction. That's the kind of question that when we hear that, we rejoice.
I mean, that would assume that when you say Torah, you mean literally the physical, like word for word, Bereshis bara Elokim, like the exact Torah.
Why do you keep saying physical? Words aren't physical.
Right. Okay. Fine.
Now leave physical out.
So
It means this particular formulation.
Words with the
Yeah, that's
exact
right.
formulation.
But I said that.
Is that what that means also?
I said that. I said that. We have it on record. It's recorded. I said you had at most 6 books, and a way of understanding the 6 books, and that would have been the sum total of all Torah information. But the books are there.
That we didn't commit the sin of the age.
Correct. Now we have more books,
Okay.
and more of them.
And I'll tell you just like on my
But-
own.
but-
Okay.
Let me before we lose the thread. We're talking about those books and all the other information that goes into understanding them. But yes, the text of the books. The answer here is one that's takes you pretty far afield. The words in the books can be understood in many different ways. And the events that we see could be applied to the words in the book in many different ways. I'll give you 1 or 2 examples. There are commentators who say the whole of the tabernacle was built only because of the sin of the golden calf. Had there not been the sin of the golden calf, the tabernacle would never have been built. Now the same question comes back in spades. There are whole chapters which describe the laws for building the tabernacle and the way in which they carried it out. What's going to happen to those chapters if they don't commit the sin of the golden calf? Surely they had the free will not to commit the sin of the golden calf. They were punished for it. So what happened to those chapters? One answer is this. Those physical descriptions of the building of the tabernacle could be taken in spiritual terms without any physical realization at all. Point number one, there's a verse in Deuteronomy which says, Maltem es or lastavavchem, circumcise the foreskins of your hearts. As a matter of medical fact, your heart is encased in a membrane. There's a physical membrane that encases the heart. The Torah is not commanding open heart surgery, for which everyone would have died in that generation, and Judaism would have been dead. No, it's a metaphor. It uses a physical description for a metaphor. Don't be hard-hearted. Don't be stubborn. Don't be overly aggressive, and so forth and so on. Well, if the Torah there for sure is using a physical description for a spiritual reality, maybe it did so elsewhere as well. As a matter of fact, gold and silver and colors and tapestries and wool and linen, all the rest, all of them have spiritual counterparts. So, if they had not committed the sin of the golden calf, all of those chapters would have been realized in spiritual ways, but not in physical ways. They wouldn't have needed a physical representation. What this shows you is that there is flexibility in understanding how the Torah should relate to a physical reality. The Zohar says that Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, in the garden, had all 613 commandments. It's all 613 commandments. That means, given who they were, which we can't even imagine, given the reality there, which we also can't imagine, given what the tree was and represented and how they interacted with it, wrapped up into their reality was everything that's expressed for us in 613 commandments. So now, if you ask, well, did they really have free will or they didn't? Maybe there's a process in the transgression where they could violate one part of the process and recover before the end of the process. Maimonides in the guide says that the eating of the tree had two steps. One was a spiritual step, and the next was a physical step, and he treats the physical step as almost an afterthought. Once they made the spiritual mistake, the physical result was a consequence of it, an afterthought of it. You could then have had the first step, pulling back, and you could have had the violation, and then recovery. All of this could be realized in a vast variety of ways. So in that sense, we could say that God looked into the Torah, and the world was created to reflect the Torah, but how the world reflects the Torah is something which is very, very flexible. It can be accomplished in many different ways.
So what you're saying is that when it says he looked into the Torah, it was literally the words that we know today.
Together with all the information that's involved in understanding it. But yes, absolutely. It's the word that we know today. Absolutely. And you're right to ask. It didn't have to be. I mean, these are midrashim, and midrashim need commentators to explain how they should be understood. But in this case, it is meant that way, directly. Yeah.
What would be the best examples to show that you need an oral Torah to interpret the written Torah?
Okay. Many have done this on the level of law, and there are many, many such examples. I've come to appreciate recently that it's even true in narrative as well. But here, I'll just give you a grab bag of that. The Torah says, don't do malacha on Shabbos. That's one of the 10 pronouncements that Sinai is mentioned at least 15 times in the Torah. It carries capital punishment. Nowhere is there a definition of malacha. Nowhere. The word has a quite vague meaning. Nowhere could you be able to decide whether signing your name or watering a plant or tearing down a house or erasing a parchment or ripping something into pieces, whether it is a malacha or it isn't a malacha, and what conditions it would be, what conditions it wouldn't be. There's absolutely no way to tell. There's nowhere in the Torah to tell you how to get married. Getting married has gigantic consequences. It determines what counts as adultery. Nowhere does the Torah say, if you do X, Y, Z, you're married. You must do X, Y, Z to get married. Now in divorce we have an embarrassment of riches. We have 6 words. 6 words. The cost of law, sefer krisus, v'nosa b'yoda. The husband should write his wife a document of severance, cutting off, and put it in her hand. 6 words to describe divorce. Anybody who's realistic will have a dozen questions leap to his mind. Oh, the husband has to write a bill of divorce? Suppose he's illiterate. Does that mean he can't divorce his wife? Suppose she's an amputee, he doesn't have hands. It means she can't divorce his wife? Suppose they're in different cities. Must he go to her and hand it to her? Could he do it with a representative? Send it by carrier pigeon, SMS? What about the text? Is bye bye baby enough? Or must it be a little more detailed and exact as to what it is the contract is involved in the contract? Must she agree to accept it, or can he give it to her against her will? There's not a clue. The text doesn't give you a clue. In the fall, there's a holiday called Sukkot. One of the instructions is to take 4 plants and perform a ceremony. One of the plants is described as Pri Eitz Hadar, 3 whole words. A beautiful fruit from a tree. Or maybe not. Maybe it means a fruit from a beautiful tree. Maybe Hadar modifies Eitz, maybe Pri. Not clear. What is that? An orange, an apple, a pear, a plum, a peach, pomegranate, Jaffa orange. The sky's the limit. Would you pick a citron? Why would you pick a citron? And how is it that the tradition only used citrons? Never did he use or suggest anything else. It goes on and on and on. There's scarcely any law which can be understood without an oral accompaniment. Rashi says this on a famous verse in Deuteronomy 12:21. I'll remember that because the number is backwards, 12:21, palindrome. Where it says, when you come into the land of Israel, and you conquer the land, and the place where the central worship will be, Shiloh, where the tabernacle was, or the temple in Jerusalem, will be distant from you. And you will want to know, am I allowed to have a barbecue in my backyard in Tveria, or in Beersheba, or in Sfas? Or must I go to the central place of worship and offer the sacrifice, and there eat the parts of the sacrifice that are permissible? Can I have a local barbecue or not? So the Torah says, yes, you can have a local barbecue. Have a good time. Enjoy yourself. Only one thing. Slaughter the animal as I commanded you. Slaughter the animal as I commanded you. And otherwise, have a great time. So the reader says, oh, slaughter the animal as I commanded you. Oh, sure. Okay. Where are those commands? Where is it described how I should slaughter the animal? Is it hidden away in the book of Exodus someplace? Or maybe in the book of Leviticus? Or maybe it's an appendix in the book of Job? Or maybe in Proverbs? Where is it? You can go through 1,000 pages of the Tanakh. There's no clue how to slaughter animals. So what is the intelligent reader supposed to say? He's supposed to say then there's more information that there is in the book. And that's what Rashi says precisely on that verse. So you have this over and over again. You also have open, obvious contradictions, back to back, where without some oral accompaniment, the text just is sort of slapping you in the face. You thought you understood it, did you? Ah, you don't understand this. For example, within 5 verses in the book of Deuteronomy, one verse says, there will be no impoverished people in the land. And the other verse says, there will never cease to be impoverished people in the land. Almost back to back. What are you supposed to do with that? Even more, in a way, when Moses is standing at the burning bush, and he says to God, when I go down to Egypt, and I tell them the Creator appeared to me, they are not going to accept it. They're not going to believe me. So God says, I'll give you miracles to do in front of them, which will convince them. Miracle number 1, take your staff and throw it down, and it becomes a snake. It becomes a staff, and you go and you pick it up. That's number 1. Number 2, put your hand in your garment, take it out, it's leprous, put it back in and take it out. It's healthy, so that they will believe you on the basis of these 2 miracles. They will believe you on the basis of these 2 miracles. Next words. And if they don't believe you, the reader, who's hopefully careful and awake, says, wait a minute, you just said they will believe me. And now we say, if they don't believe you, how can that be? So obviously the text there is waving a flag and saying, you thought you understood, didn't you? Too bad, you don't understand. Go for an explanation, which I gave together with the text. Now, having said all of this, I've got to tell you one crucial thing. Now, I want to save you from a mistake that affects many people, including people with black hats and black velvet yarmulkes with 2 layers and stitched together. And that is, you must know this. Which came first, the oral or the written? the oral came first. At Sinai, they had a book. Book started with Genesis and read up to about chapter 20 of Exodus, up to the Revelation. That's it. Moses went up the mountain after they heard the 10 pronouncements. Moses went up the mountain and got the entirety of the oral law. Almost. Maybe 6 things missing. And then he taught it to the people. And he taught it to the people for decades. And the book they got only at the end of his life. The oral came first and the book came afterwards. This is one of the reasons people always ask, why doesn't the book say that there's an oral Torah? Because if you lived through it historically, it would be dreadfully redundant. You're living in a world in which the oral Torah has been taught for decades. Now you get a book which has certain summaries and certain pieces that are written down. The book came later. I'll give you an analogy. United States law, any law, Congress, state legislature, city law, any law can be struck down by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional. Right? You all know that. Not a single law in the entire country says, we're telling you to do X, but of course, if the Supreme Court strikes it down, then it'll be null and void. Not a single law says that. Why not? Every law is subject to the Supreme Court. Why doesn't it say that? Because everybody knows that. Everybody's living in a country with the Supreme Court. These cases come up all the time. So the writers of the national laws and the local laws take it for granted that you're aware that, of course, it can be struck down by the Supreme Court and writing something that everybody knows. Indeed, Rav Hirsch gives the analogy of the written Torah to the oral like lecture notes to a lecture. You went to the lecture, you wrote down notes for yourself to remind yourself of what the lecture said. You who were there, you heard the lecture. You're just jotting down a few notes to remind yourself of what you heard. You don't have to be told these are lecture notes. You have to write down, the professor said more than this, and he said it in such and such a way, and I'm only taking notes, and it's that. You wrote them. You wrote them as your own summary. You don't write that into the notes. So the question why the written doesn't specify the oral, given the history of the transmission, I can't get excited about the question. It's not a great question. There'll be a later time in which people will say maybe there wasn't an oral, maybe it came up later. Okay, people will think up all sorts of crazy things. People think of all sorts of absurd things. But for the people who are experiencing it at the time, there's absolutely no reason to write it in. There are cases where the written relies on the oral. That's because it did in fact come into a context in which there was a vast body of oral information. And that's how we can reason backwards and say that of course there was an oral, because the written couldn't understand without it. But to have an explicit statement of it, it's not absolutely necessary. There is a verse in Leviticus, I can look it up for you if you like, where the word Toros is used. Torah in plural. The Torahs. And Rashi on that verse says, one written and one oral. Okay, it says, keep my statutes and my commandments and my testimonies and my Toros. Okay, if you want a case where you see a reference, but the text doesn't make a big deal out of it because it came into existence for a community for whom the oral law was something that they've been practicing and studying and analyzing and memorizing for already 30 plus years. Okay.